think, oh, good afternoon also for the recording. My name is Christina Heckes. I'm at the moment the Academic Director of Sustainable Global Economic Law, or SGEL as we call it for our convenience and your confusion. And I was asked to say a few words about our project to start with. So I should start by saying that it's a cooperation that was originally conceived by the Amsterdam Center for European Law and Governance, the Amsterdam Center for International Law, and the Amsterdam Center for Transformative Private Law. And that already says something about the group of people that comes together, which comes from a diverse group of subfields, so European law, international and private law, and who apply a very diverse range of perspectives to their inquiry. And I think that is really at the core of sustainable global economic law. And what we try to do is we try to expose how law creates the political and economic conditions in which climate and environmental crises reinforce social injustices and the other way around, how they interact. And we are trying to tease out really this constitutive role of law for the political and economic status quo, and what that means for the growing inequalities and global warming. And in that context, we hold today's conference, where we hope that we have an external exchange in a similar manner as we interact within SGEL. So with the idea of really bringing together very different views, other disciplines, critical theory, social science, economics, gender studies, to the law, thinking about the law, and develop these insights, exchange on our ideas. And really what we try to do is to set a breeding ground for potential new cooperations, for new inspiration, and we hope, and new insights, hopefully, of today's conversation. And our aim is really to do that in a conversational manner. But on the topics and on the panels and how we structure the day, I will hand over to Ivana Isailovic, who has organized this conference and brought these great people together that we are already now seeing on the Zoom screen. I think you need to unmute. Yeah.
Hi, everyone. My name is Ivana Isailovic. I'm assistant professor of law at University of Amsterdam, where I work on law, political economy, and gender. And I am at the moment also the academic coordinator of the SGEL project. I want to join Professor Heckes in welcoming you to this two-day event that will explore the intersections between global economic law, sustainability, and environmental and social justice. Thank you all for being here. Before I give the floor to the panelists in the first roundtable, I wanted to say a few words about how this conference came to be. When I started thinking about this event last year, I wasn't quite sure how it would turn out. And not only because of the uncertainties related to the ongoing pandemic and the social crisis that we are going through. SGEL, as Christina mentioned, is a very ambitious and unique project. It attempts to create a connective tissue between environmental concerns and social justice, which is very much underdeveloped when looking at global economic law. At the same time, every single one of the words which describes the project, sustainable, economic, global, and law, is in its own way and does not benefit from a shared understanding amongst the scholars from different disciplines who are concerned with sustainability and global economic law. The economic non-economic divide, for instance, is central to law and legal education in the global north, and yet it seems increasingly unhelpful to understand how law operates globally. The notion of sustainability seems to be the new buzzword in law and is mobilized by a very diverse group of legal actors, from multinationals to grassroots movements and far-right political actors. But it is unclear whether the concept became or is becoming a tool of neoliberal governance perpetuating inequalities, or whether it can truly foster social change. And finally, law has itself enabled and legitimized the ecological crisis that go hand in hand with the reproduction of racial, gendered, and other forms of exclusion at the global level. At the same time, law is also what could protect planetary resources and address various forms of oppression and tame private power. So trying to imagine this event felt exciting and daunting at the same time. So I started thinking about different scholars and how they might be able to offer different perspectives to try to situate our thinking in relation to this complex landscape. I drafted a series of questions and provocation and sent them around to several speakers, and one of them actually answered, "It's confused and confusing enough, count me in." And I'm just slightly paraphrasing. I'm truly grateful that some of my favorite scholars and friends, people who I have learned so much from, enthusiastically answered yes to this invitation to take part in these exploratory conversations. Speakers are joining us from around the world, from Jordan to the US, Finland, Australia. Thank you so much for being here and so generously accepting to share your ideas. This event is not meant to provide you with solutions. Rather, the goal is to create space for critical reflections on the links between the law and environmental and social justice. And perhaps these conversations will help us catch some tentative responses and ways forward. So many of you know that academic events very often run on invisible labor. Mine is not quite invisible because I'm making it pretty visible right now. But organizing this conference would not have been possible without the immense help that I received from Alicia van der Werf, who supports us in terms of organization and communication. Thank you so much, Alicia. And I also want to thank Christina for her trust. And finally, a thank you to the colleagues who helped me brainstorm about this event. And I'm especially grateful to Matthew Canfield and Philippe Pemont, who helped me think through some of the questions and accepted to moderate the roundtables. And before I close, I wanted to mention that one of the most inspiring intellectuals who wrote about what a meaningful community building, love, and a world free of racism and patriarchy might mean, Bell Hooks, passed away yesterday. Her work is a constant source of inspiration and strength. Now let's move on to the first roundtable entitled Constructing the Economy, Nature, Value. Let me briefly introduce the moderator, Matthew Canfield. Matthew is Assistant Professor of Law and Society and Law and Development at Leiden University. He is a cultural anthropologist, and his work sits at the intersection of anthropology and socio-legal studies. His forthcoming book, which will be published by Stanford University Press in April, is entitled Cultivating Justice in an Age of Transnational Governance. And it looks at how networks of transnational activists mobilize the right to food sovereignty across global and local context. Matt, the floor is yours, and have a great event, everyone.
Well, thank you so much, Ivana, and hello, everyone. I am thrilled to be moderating this first panel. And our first panel for this conference really is going to interrogate the meaning of the economic. You know, as we all know, the sources, content, and actors that comprise the field of international economic law are the subject of much debate, depending on how broadly one interprets the field. But our discussion today is not simply focused on what kinds of norms and legal processes we should incorporate in our conception of sustainable global economic law, but rather how the meaning of the economic is constituted. So our panelists today are going to be thinking deeply about these questions such as what forms of knowledge, gendered assumptions, and racial frameworks underlie conceptions of the economic, through what technical devices is the economy produced as an object of calculation and human manipulation, and how does growing attention to values that underlie global legality shape, constrain, or reproduce growing inequalities and the ongoing climate catastrophe. So our speakers today are coming from a wide range of legal backgrounds and engage these questions in different ways through their work. So I'm going to introduce our speakers in the order in which they will be speaking. Amy Cohen is the Professor of Law at University of New South Wales and the Robert J. Reinstein Chair in Law at Temple University School of Law. She's a creative and interdisciplinary scholar whose work takes a socio-legal approach to fields of mediation and dispute resolution, as well as law and economic development, particularly in the context of food and agriculture. And in combining these two fields, her research has offered critical insights into the politics of emerging forms of experimental and transnational governance. Next, we have Isabel Feichtner, who is Professor of Public Law and International Economic Law at University of Würzburg, and Principal Investigator of the Research Network for Democracy. And her research focuses on law in the political economy of money and natural resources, and she has written on numerous topics from the WTO to the practice of international law and human rights in extractive resources, to the public role of money, to the public role of law and the legal architecture of money, and most recently on commons and the constitution of value through law with Geoff, who is also our next speaker. Geoff Gordon is a senior researcher at the Osser Institute, and his research focuses on questions of international and transnational law at the interface of politics, security, economy, and technology. And his current research looks at artificial intelligence and applications of global governance. And finally, Usha Natarajan, who is the Edward Said Fellow at Columbia University and a senior fellow at Melbourne Law School. And her interdisciplinary research has helped to develop post-colonial and third world approaches to international law and use these frameworks to really illuminate the intersections of development, environment, migration, and conflict. So I've invited each of our speakers to begin with 5 minutes to make an opening remark in which I've asked them to think about how they engage with and work with concepts of the economy and value and nature in their work, as well as the lessons this work poses for the way we should begin to think about sustainable legal practices, structures, and institutions. So with that, I'm going to pass it to Amy for our first intervention.
Wonderful. Can you all hear me? Yeah, okay. So let me just start by thanking Ivana and Matt and Alicia and Christina. I'm just so honored and delighted to be part of this conversation. And what I thought I would do for just my 5 minutes is talk a bit about an ongoing project I have with Andrew Lang from the University of Edinburgh on fair trade. And we think the project speaks to our roundtable questions because fair trade is an example of market making that purposely collapses common binaries, such as politics versus markets or economic versus non-economic. And the project, we try to trace how fair trade actors use markets to create their own desired political communities. In so doing, we're also trying to trace changing ideas of the meaning of the social today. So motivating us is this big and kind of amorphous question about what this social means after the disintegration of the idea that this social is something to be constituted through public political processes. So we ultimately argue that contemporary fair trade illuminates a distinctly neoliberal mode of constituting the social, but one that does not rely on politics versus market or economic versus non-economic, those distinctions that commonly accompany descriptions of neoliberalism. So I'm worried that's a very condensed argument that might not be terribly intelligible. So I'm gonna walk through some of the detail in my next 4 minutes and see if I can bring it together. So to summarize the narrative, here's just a very blunt description that draws on other scholars' work. So in the 60s and 70s, in the early moments of the modern fair trade movement, actors worked against the conventional market. They built alternative trading relations where consumers could care for producers and for an equitable division of surplus. By the late 1980s, fair trade actors made strategic decisions to work within and through the conventional market. They translated what were still very deeply held ethical values into techniques of valuation, practices of standard setting, auditing, certification, accreditation, labeling. Now, these translations enabled fair trade proponents to collaborate with large corporations. That was part of their purpose. These translations also enabled market competition. So different fair trade organizations used techniques of valuation to produce different answers to very contested questions. For example, should fair trade include plantation-produced goods? And if so, what should workers' rights be? Or how far should fair trade standards include matters like animal welfare or environmental sustainability or organic production? And by the turn of the century, fair trade marks have proliferated based on different answers to these and many other questions. And in response, actors created private governance systems to organize the competitions among these marks. So in 2002, the four major ethical standards certifications bodies, Fair Trade Labeling Organization, Forest Stewardship Council, Marine Stewardship Council, and International Federation over Organic Agricultural Movements created the ISEAL Alliance, which now includes many corporate-led initiatives among its members. I want to make this quick point. So ISEAL, as an example of a private governance regime, doesn't seek to resolve substantive disagreements among members who differ on crucial questions. For example, debates have included whether members can certify commodities produced via non-organic methods, or whether they can certify commodities with GMO seeds. To the contrary, ISEAL encourages members to collaborate to reach a procedural consensus about credible market-making techniques, or what makes certification, accountability, audit, evaluation a credible process. And then ISEAL encourages these collaborators to compete to produce whatever substantive outcomes they result. So in the face of value difference, ISEAL offers private governance techniques where it's always possible to create a new credible mark and market, and where this mark and market is always subject to further competition and change. So ISEAL thus mobilizes specific techniques of valuation to address questions of value without seeking to resolve them. Again, it's proceduralization to minimize the amount of social agreement necessary for collaboration. And then it's competition to produce whatever consumer-facing outcomes follow. So we analyze these techniques of valuation as part of a neoliberal approach to governance. But our understanding of what constitutes neoliberal governance perhaps differs from others. So we don't describe an approach to governance that imposes a single neoliberal order of value, like market value, that then cannibalizes all other values. Right? That's actually not what's happening here. But we try to describe an approach to governance that evades a shared consensus or a reference to a pre-constituted social to resolve questions of value in favor of the subjective evaluative techniques associated with the sovereign consumer. Or to put this another way, the groups of producers and consumers and traders that today coalesce around a fair trade label don't take the form of publics, at least not in any traditional sense associated with a democratic polity. Nor do they take the form of unions among producers, laborers, and consumers that once served as a normative foundation for a previous political imaginary. Instead, they're rather contingent, provisional, and thin social formations that can forge loose and temporary alliances with other collectives, specifically corporations. So I'm just going to conclude now by just saying but we're also witnessing a different approach to fair trade today based on what Arturo Escobar calls an ethic of strong relationality. So today, food sovereignty activists are calling not for more certification or standard setting, but in part what they call territorial markets. Now, territorial markets are local, regional, or national markets that are characterized by short supply chains, where smallholders, traders, consumers, and authorities are supposed to negotiate commonly shared rules, including perhaps by contextualizing ethical, social, political, and historical relations. And as is all very nascent, it's nascent in the food sovereignty literature, and I won't be able to flesh it out with any satisfactory level of detail. But I anyway offer the example of the territorial market because it reminds us just how much the forms and techniques of market making matter. shaping the amount and kinds of shared agreements that people think are necessary to successfully and ethically exchange. So I'll just conclude by saying that today it would seem that movement actors reinterpreting fair trade are articulating a new, but also very old question. Right? How to create forms of exchange that perform diverse social and political and economic functions, here perhaps outside of neoliberal governance logics. So thank you.
Wonderful. With that, I'm going to pass it to Isabel and Geoff.
Thank you, Matt, and Ivana and everyone for inviting us. So we'll just go through your 3 questions, Matt, and do this together. So on the first question, how do I define the economy of value? I don't really work on the basis of a clear-cut definition, but I think when I chose the law of money and natural resources as a research field, this choice was very much motivated by the observation that this law is central to a social sphere aimed at the generation of surplus value, that is profit, a social sphere characterized by increasing inequality and quite unconcerned with the destructive effects on its environments, on human beings, other creatures, and their relations. And I agree with Marxian views that see capitalist surplus value production as formative of society, and with those who observe that this economic logic colonizes, or as Amy said, cannibalizes other societal spheres. So we might differ there. I believe we all see this in our universities. We might want to produce value in the form of knowledge, yet our academia increasingly is drawn into regimes of monetary value production. Thus, I believe that research interested in social ecological transformation, which might entail a democratization of society, including the economy, labor, money, must engage with modes of value production.
Great. And so here I'll chime in on this question just to foreground what I think is a complementary proposition, familiar probably to most on this call, that the economy is an argument. Right? So that's how I approach it, or a framing device for an argument. Economic activity may be any activity for the conversion or exchange of resources, goods, things, etc., meaning that very broadly, but the economy, in square quotes, is never the additive sum of all such activity. It's an abstraction always that includes some of those economic or potentially economic activities and excludes others, privileging some relative to others as policy, usually coercively backed policy. The abstract argument that is the economy then further functions as a heuristic to organize relations among the activities that fall within or without its frame, privileging some of those relations and suppressing others. I'll turn it back to Isabel for the second of the 3 questions.
Okay. Yeah, the second question was what legal practices, institutions, forms shape what is considered economic, and I would like to reformulate what make the economic. So in the field of resource extraction beyond national jurisdiction, it's very apparent in my view, that and how law and legal techniques are crucial. One, for spatially expanding the economy into the deep sea, into outer space. 2, for shaping the mode of extraction, whether it is competitive or cooperative, whether it is aimed at generating a rate of return that is profit, or at provisioning that is meeting demands for certain raw materials. And 3, for valuation, not only of the mined minerals, but also the seabed creatures and ecosystems that are being harmed by mining. And I believe that to properly assess the extent to which the law co-constitutes this and other economies, we need to overcome disciplinary borders, just as you do in your project. Because if we only look to public international law, for example, much of the legal infrastructure of money and finance that is crucial for making the economy escapes our sight. And I also do think that there are some topics like the interrelation of public finance and money, which even fall between the cracks of disciplinary boundaries so that neither private lawyers nor public lawyers really can grasp that legal formation of the economy.
Great. And so here I just sort of retrace Isabel's steps, but on a parallel track, starting again from when an abstraction of the economy is taken as primary, or defining, the understanding of what qualifies as economic becomes determined by that framing device. So the framing abstraction of the economy in the West has been joined to materially and historically unequal social relations, which has served as engines of extraction and accumulation through this selective distinction of what qualifies for inclusion within the frame of the economy as economic and how under law. Isabel and I have been working on a project together, already introduced, with a lot of wonderful collaborators, and we may try to draw on some of those examples in this discussion, but to examine multiple legal governmental technologies that privilege some values and arguably suppress others, and by definition, privileging and suppressing people and groups as it does so, in each case through imbrication in economic regimes. I came to that project through time technologies, which were an entry point for me into the socio-technical and infrastructural supports that condition change and reproduction under law in socioeconomic relations. And these are more examples of things that sometimes escape an international lawyer's sight, as Isabel has pointed to, and probably something I'll try to draw on further in this discussion. And there was a third question asked to us, but I'll introduce that one. How should we think about sustainable economic law? As a response to this, I'll just be very glib and leave the substance to Isabel. I'll say only we should think about it as a fight all the way down, one which is going to produce new losers as well as winners. And Isabel, I hand it back to you.
Yeah, I wanted to add that I do see two important sides of struggle in which law and lawyers are involved. And one is the quest to contain or roll back the market, to deprivatize and re-socialize spheres that have been colonized by profit logic. In Germany, it's currently mostly visible as concerns housing, with the initiative that you may know to socialize real estate. A moratorium on seabed mining could also be understood as such a rollback initiative. And the other is aimed at, broadly speaking, collective self-organization of provisioning. I find promising in that respect transdisciplinary research on commoning, research that builds on Eleanor Ostrom's work on design principles in the collective governance of common goods, but takes this research much further by asking about techniques or about patterns to bring about commons, and these need not be natural resources, but can be knowledge resources, urban commons, open source seeds, to cultivate commons and to protect them against recolonization. And I do see some of these things, like Amy, happening in the food sovereignty sphere, where we could try to look more closely at patterns of commoning. That was our contribution.
Fantastic. Okay, and now I'm going to ask Usha to intervene.
Thank you. Can you all hear me? Yep, great. So thank you, Ivana, Matthew, fellow panelists, and of course the University of Amsterdam for this opportunity for us to talk together about sustainable global economic law. So I work on environmental justice issues, and I'm part of the Third World Approaches to International Law TWAIL movement. So my work focuses on how environmental issues affect peoples in the global south. So for this purpose, I rather than define economy in my work, I examine who defines economy and value in international law, who is left out, and what the implications are for environmental justice. And starting points are to just say that people value different things. And in terms of what constitutes the economy, people count different things and do so in different ways. But international law has difficulty reflecting this multiplicity, given its history as this conduit for Eurocentric values writ large. And international law is, of course, not alone in this, with the cultural priorities of those who shape the discipline of economics reflected in decisions about what values do not count economically or are counted in ways that reproduce existing harms or that create new harms. One example would be Western perceptions of scarcity and plenty, and how central that has been to constructing the economy, shaping what is counted, how it's counted, and why it's counted. Western accessibility when it comes to fossil fuels worldwide over the last 2 centuries has, of course, fueled economic growth at unprecedented rates, but it's also encouraged economic calculation based on this possibility of unlimited economic growth. And this perception then shapes how the economy is measured. Instead of counting natural wealth, productiveness, or waste, economists count aggregate income, the sum of every instance of money changing hands, because each instance represents income for the recipient, regardless of the transaction's productiveness or waste or impact on natural wealth. And because these goods and money can change hands limitlessly, the same goods and money may be counted multiple times, and the waste incurred as the income is generated, the exhaustion of natural resources, of labor, of machinery, is not counted in the same way. So economics gradually withdraws from the studying of the capacities of nature and natural resources, including human labor in that, and turns into the science and technology of commodification and pricing. And in international law, this divorce of economy from ecology is evident in how environmental issues are addressed. With international environmental law emerging from Western environmentalism and enshrining these understandings as a putatively global value. And these environmental laws focus then on regulating waste rather than consumption, while at the same time we have international economic laws that regulate the exploitation of natural resources, which is of course the source of pollution and waste. And these laws encourage limitless growth. So race and culture do determine the shape of these legal structures, and concepts such as economy, value, environment, law, and sustainability. And international law structures this world where the rich and powerful few causing environmental destruction and inequality are shielded from responsibility and from harm, and continue to multiply their privileges, while the masses that experience these harms are systemically silenced. So in terms of how we should think about sustainable global economic law, it seems to me that global economic law and the environmental injustice it structures has proved to be very sustainable so far, in the sense that inequality and environmental destruction continually increase. So those responsible for causing harm and inequality don't experience global economic law necessarily as unsustainable, or necessarily feel any compulsion to rethink economy or law or global and so on. But from the point of view of those who experience these harms, the vast majority of whom are in the global south, justice does require transcending, among other things, the economy-ecology distinction, to recognize that we can't separate the way we treat each other from the way we treat the environment. So what I mean by that is that environmental justice requires more than a redistribution of environmental benefits and harms. It's a demand that the poor majority who bear the brunt of ecological change participate in knowledge production based on their own experiences with scarcity and surplus, with consumption and waste, with culture and history, and so on. So those creating the harm shouldn't determine the scope of the available remedies. I'll stop there for now.
Wonderful. Thank you so much. So we have about half an hour for a discussion and I have some questions, and then we'll pass it over to and open up for discussion or questions from the audience. But before I pose any questions, I wanted to ask our panelists if they have any initial responses to one another. I'm seeing none. No? Okay. All right. So one of the questions that I have for you all as we're thinking about this is, as we're thinking about sort of questions of what we might think of the economic or non-economic, the kinds of questions of the art of separation that is inherent in liberal legal thought, Many of us have worked with these critiques and built on these critiques, whether they're coming from Marxist analysis, that challenges the separation of the economic from the political as a way of limiting sort of the democratization of the economy, or from feminist analyses that have critiqued the separation of the economic and non-economic as a framework that devalues unpaid care labor necessary for social reproduction, or from a sort of political ecology framework that really challenges the separation of economic from non-economic, because it's premised on northern epistemologies that distinguish economy from ecology and enable limitless expansion. So as we're thinking about these boundaries, one of my questions is, do we need to redraw the boundaries between economic or non-economic? That is, to redefine the economic in a more expansive way, or do we need to fundamentally rethink these categories? And one of the things that I'm hearing from many of you is about thinking about the techniques of valuation, processes of quantification, processes of these sort of technical processes that are inherent in market making. So I want to ask you each to expand on sort of how you're thinking about what analytical frameworks we might draw on to think about if we're moving beyond economic and non-economic, or if we're still working with these sort of binaries. And I'll let, who would like to jump in? Does anybody want to jump in first? All right, thanks, Geoff.
Yeah, I could jump in, I suppose. I mean, I have a huge amount of sympathy and ambivalence with respect to the question. I think Amy is already pointing to some very fundamental change, though, because of the vocabulary and the register in which you, Amy, and Andrew are doing this, I think that's going to sound anathema to a lot of people on this call. And I don't necessarily think that it should. At the same time, so I tend to lean towards a desire for fundamental change as opposed to tinkering with the quantification regimes and the measurements for reasons that I think Usha has made extremely clear. Together with Isabel in the project, there's one chapter that I would, in this project on value production, that I would bring here as a cautionary tale, and the author intentionally contributed it as a cautionary tale for our project. Claire Quentin has produced a chapter on global tax policy, in which what was a Marxist, perhaps post-Marxist agenda to reconceptualize fairly fundamentally labor and tax precisely along the lines that your question has suggested, Matt, shows how this desire to reallocate tax burdens and their rewards according to what was free labor comes out to basically screw labor under a digital economy a decade and a half after it starts to reach some level of prominence. So in the introductory comments where I was talking about a fight all the way down with new losers, part of this fight wound up being self-destructive. Precisely through winning, it produced losers out of the community that at that time, and not that far ago historically, it was supposed to support. So these fundamental rethinks are incredibly fraught. It's the sort of simplification of that long intervention.
Amy, Isabel, Usha?
Yeah, I've been somehow struggling with also in your prompt this drawing the line between the economic and the non-economic, and how we sustain the line and might redraw the line. That's why I try to define the economy I'm concerned with a capitalist economy, because then it makes sense for me to say this is a problem, and then we could say we want to overcome it, or we just want to change the economy so it works according to a different logic. The other thing I was reminded of with the boundary drawing is a debate we have in Germany in the post-war legal sphere, which and there is a group of lawyers which have always been arguing against the separation of state and society, and the economy is part of the society, and it's an ordoliberal approach which says the state will be democratized, but society, including the economy is the realm of individual freedom expressed through what we do with our property and the contracts we conclude, and that should be insulated from any democratization ambitions. And I'm very much with those lawyers who said, no, if we have a democratic society, that means we have to democratize not only state institutions, but we have to democratize society, and that means we need to democratize the economy. And that's in a way how I came to value, because I think, okay, of course, we can't just have only workers' councils. I mean, that's a good thing, but it's not just that we take what we know from politics, assemblies, and transpose them to the economy, but we have to rethink value production so that we can speak of a realization of freedom in relation in the sphere of the economy. And that then, thinking about value, brought me to commoning, because that's where I see really promising reorganizations of what I called collective provisioning on the basis of patterns and practices of commoning, which are based on collaboration, solidarity, oriented not by what rate of return we can expect, but whether our desires and needs are being satisfied for people who engage.
I'll just stop there.
Usha, did you want to jump in on this?
Yeah, so I think that, so one of the projects I've been working on recently is with Julia Dem, who will be speaking later at this conference. And we are committed to fundamental rethinking, primarily because we start from the scale of environmental change today. That, you know, it is unprecedented in human history, more carbon dioxide than we've seen in 3.5 million years, an extinction of species we haven't seen in 66 million years, nitrogen imbalance in the atmosphere. Most of our atmosphere is nitrogen that we haven't seen in 2.5 billion years. So then, you know, change on that scale is going to destabilize conventional knowledge production. It will do it whether we like it or not. So so from that sense, we then proceeded to looking at who created this situation, how, you know, it is a result of hyperbolic inequality, that you do have, like, you know, 2 states in the United States emitting as much as the whole of sub-Saharan Africa. So, you know, so in that sense, you know, why should we keep relying on the same understandings of economy to try and solve these problems? We're not going to be able to do that. I don't think that's even going to be a possibility. And so in that sense, one of the areas that I've been interested in certainly is the distinction between human and non-human realms, for instance, in terms of how we understand economy and ecology, and the relationship between that and issues of gender and race. That, you know, just as the economy doesn't usually count costs that accrue in the non-human realm, there's similar externalization of an invisibilization of non-waged labor, low-waged labor, treated as resources freely available, like the air that we breathe. And, you know, obviously that type of labor is disproportionately carried out by women and racialized people and racialized women. So because the oppression of people and nature are so entangled with marginalized humans explicitly and implicitly compared with non-human animals condemned to the natural realm, and then, you know, struggling for legal personhood in similar ways, doing work that's perceived to be close to nature. And then if we look at nature, which is frequently characterized in very feminized and racialized ways as well, that makes me then engage with the, not so much the boundaries of economy, but in terms of engaging with these issues in a way that doesn't blur the boundaries, but that enters into the question from a different heritage, not necessarily one of Bacon and Descartes and Kant and Hegel, but like, there are other ways of understanding these things in the world, where pairs of opposites only point to the place from which you can transcend that. That's what they're used for in many cultures, in Hinduism, in Buddhism, in Taoism, and so on. That there's the field of opposites, boundary making. The purpose of it is not to transcend them and enter into some kind of emptiness, but to sit in that place and see interconnection, interdependence, the infinite multiplicity of subject positions, all the things that law cannot currently contain, because there is a strict division between subject and object, and multiplying that over and over again as we try to deal with environmental problems, fairness in trade, and so on and so forth. So I guess that's why, I think that for me it is a fundamental rethinking. So I'll stop there.
So one of the things that that I think, as we're turning to these questions about thinking about relationality and thinking about commons and thinking about values, which I see all of you pushing us towards, rather than thinking with these binary categories. One of the questions that I think gets raised is really about scale, as Usha said, and particularly a question about of how we think about values in the context of global scales. And one tension that I see a little bit within some of your work. So Isabel, in some of your, in the kind of what you had sent to me and what you and Geoff had sent to me before, you argue that, at this point, we don't need a new economic constitution of shared values, that we actually have to focus on practices of commoning, valuation practices as a way of thinking about how we're going to think about more kind of relational or out of these box thinking. And I think, Amy, one of the things that you point to is the challenges that as we move to the global scale, thinking about just techniques evaluation or processes evaluation, taking on a sort of process rationality ends up, without a sense of shared values or without a clearly defined public, ends up sort of reproducing neoliberal thinking in new ways. And so one of the things that I was wondering if you could think through a little bit is this question of, as we're thinking about some of these other categories, about the social and values, and how we think about them from a more relational perspective, how might we do that? And what is the relationship, particularly between value and neoliberalism? Because value seems to be all the rage within neoliberal talk, whether we're thinking about global value chains or other sorts of values. So, I know that you've done a lot of thinking about that, so I wanted to invite you to, think about that a little bit out loud.
I might jump in if I'm looking at the other. Also looking around the audience. So, if anyone wants to turn this into a wider discussion, I don't mean to take up too much floor. But so I hear in this question echoes of a different question that circulated around the panel in terms of the sort of hyper-proliferation of values talk linked up with value as a neoliberal technology. And certainly, part of what motivated Isabel and myself was, can we redeem some sort of fight around values while resisting this hyperproliferation as a specific technology in its many and very frustratingly fluid forms? I think Amy has spoken to the complexities of that, and I will point to a place of really sort of brutal simplicity where it's doing bad work, the hyperproliferation in these new technology spaces, mostly around communications infrastructures, for instance, the European initiative Gaia X, or the production right now of these big flagships around quantum technologies, they mostly lead with a lot of talk about values, that these things are to redeem European values. They give some substance. It's not totally substanceless. Part of it is the idea that value has to be recaptured for European polities away from a select number of American firms that control data and its flow. But then as you dig into the details of all of these instruments, the Gaia X production or the flagships, the only place where value then becomes concrete, except by opposition to certain scary parties, is in literally only two forms: as a embrace of free markets and economic growth. And then if you look at how these mechanisms then receive and reallocate resources within them, what is free markets is, as I think this call will know, selectively subsidized markets with extremely limited access. So this idea of economic growth is filtered through free markets as the only two places where this constant production of values really means a self-reinforcing support to a very limited number of information firms and high technologies groups. And when they are startups, they're drawing from a very culturally select group of people, and the capital that supports it. So I'll pretty much stop there just in terms of how this is working in a couple of sort of cutting edge spaces, but it's at the WTO in the form of strategic autonomy is the umbrella term that's representing value. It's in other places in terms of digital sovereignty. So value is working on a lot of fronts at these technological spaces constantly to reinforce a very select number of players. Those players then sit on top of information flows, which gets into a lot of the larger reproductive processes that Usha has been pointing to.
Yeah, maybe I'd like to add, because Matt, you said, so we wrote, we don't want a new constitution of values. And I thought I should explain that, because I mean, sometimes today, I think in public debate, at least in Germany, we often hear we need a new values consensus. We need a new big narrative about our values in order then to realign, for example, the economy with these values and somehow face our existential threats. And turning back to these post-war lawyers I admire, like Abendroth, Ritter, Wietholte, I mean, they showed very well how especially lawyers were part of building this superstructure of values, reading it into the constitution and closing down politics, closing down democratization efforts, and stabilizing a status quo which served some and not others. And I see that danger. So I'm very much attracted to, so not adding values to value, but look right away to value. Would it mean doing away with value? Because we had these debates in our project. If we talk about value, it's usually surplus value in the Marxian sense of surplus profit. So we might just do away completely with value. But then there are people whose work I admire, like Brian Masumi, who said, no, surplus value production is actually maybe a good thing, and we might learn from the financial industry and the mechanisms, but what we should strive for is not surplus value, monetary surplus value, but surplus value of lived experience. And there again, I see a connection to commoning, where like vivacity, lived experience is a measure of value. So it's not then just to say, okay, we have to go back from exchange value to use value, which means we look at our needs, and it might become very limited and totalizing. We could still aim for surplus value, but it just needs to be redefined. It needs to take different forms, but it should not be. At the moment, I'm at this point where I agree with those who said it should not be normative. It should not be about building a new constitution of values or values narrative, because I don't think that's promising, or rather dangerous.
Well, I don't have too much to add, but I will just say that one of the reasons I became interested in environmental justice in the first place is that I was concerned about what was being done in the name of environmental protection. And so I do look at, and a lot of what Amy has described resonates really strongly with what's happening through environmental law. And I think a lot of that is because the concept of the environment is so broad that lawyers can limitlessly govern in the name of protecting the environment, because, what is it? And so we have this infinite ability to create new subjects of governance. We have, very, very rapidly growing field of environmentality, and the way it's linked with neoliberalism is really not any different to how Amy described in terms of fair trade. And I think that, or what Geoff described either, so is rather worrying, how widely it resonates. And I think that because we do seem to be somewhat at a loss, because even when these solutions haven't worked, for instance, in the climate field, economic solutions to environmental problems didn't work under Kyoto, and yet we persevere under the Paris Agreement. So there is this sort of faith that somehow green growth can be configured in a way that new forms of value can do more than what they've done in the past. And obviously it's very worrying for people from a trail perspective, because it's so similar to the way international law has responded to issues of colonialism, slavery, apartheid, racial discrimination, everything in the past, in that, you can continue to do what you're doing, don't make reparations, there's no cessation of harm, move problems around the world. So I think that for the focus on creation of new types of values is really what drew me to the issue of environmental justice in the first place. So I don't think I have more to say than that, because I think you've all described what's going on really well. So I'll stop.